All right, everyone, good evening. My name is Drew Lawrence. I'll be your host and moderator for this webinar. And I can't express how lucky we are to have you, Kelly, here today to do this webinar with us. Kelly is the managing editor for The War Horse. It's a nonprofit journalism publication that really has anything that you could ask for in a military publication. It's reflections, investigations, hard-hitting news, really your one-stop shop for insight into military life from spouses, from currently serving military, and from veterans. And Kelly is really the person who steers that ship and helps bring those reflections in and edits them. She was in the Army herself, serving in Desert Storm, spent time in Mogadishu and Somalia. And then she left the Army and took her talents to journalism and was embedded with units in Afghanistan and Iraq and won so many awards there. And then really went on to the War Horse, where they've been doing such great work into things like water toxicity and veteran health, burn pits, that type of thing. So really, as I said in the beginning, we truly are lucky to have you, Kelly. And I won't butcher the War Horse anymore. I'll turn it over to you to kind of talk a little bit about the War Horse, your career as a journalist and as a veteran journalist, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, thanks, Drew. Yeah, I feel like I've got the dream job, and it stays the dream job. Usually you start a job and think it's the best, and then that sort of goes away after the reality sits in. But it's a really great job. So, so Thomas Brennan, a few years ago, 5 years ago, got out of the Marine Corps, decided that he wanted to be a journalist. Actually, he was a journalist before 5 years ago when he started the War Horse, but he decided he wanted to start a publication that was military and veteran based. And I actually remember him coming to me and saying, I want to do this thing and I'm going to start it from scratch. And I'm like, well, you go on with your little backpack and do your thing. And meet my words now, he's built an incredible place. So the War Horse is a nonprofit newsroom, as you were saying. It's meant to help conquer the military-civilian divide by pushing out stories that are of interest to both civilians and service members and veterans. Any newspaper in the country, any news organization in the country could take our stories for free. And part of the reason Thomas wanted to do that was because so many military journalists at small newspapers are being laid off. They're just, newspapers are dying. And unfortunately, one of the biggest homes of news deserts are around military bases. So our service members aren't getting good news about military issues. Besides Military Times and military.com and those publications, which are also great. So our publication features reflections, as you were saying. So once a week, we run a veterans or a service member's essay. And then once every 2 weeks, we do a feature or an investigative piece. I came to War Horse after meeting Thomas at a military writing conference. He was learning how to write when he'd just gotten out of the Marine Corps. And about a year and a half ago, he hit me up and said, we need a managing editor, and here I am. But before that, like you said, I was in the military. I got out, went to school for journalism, studied Middle Eastern history, went to work at several publications, the Oregonian, the Salt Lake Tribune, did an internship at the Chicago Tribune when I was like 35, before going to the Military Times papers and doing those embeds. But I think that's about it as far as me and my background.
Sure. So we want to focus a little bit about the War Horse as a whole, but we're here to talk about the art of pitching and the art of freelancing for the War Horse. Mm-hmm. For those who don't know, the War Horse is, as Kelly was talking about, has so many reflections, but it's such a great place for veteran writers, as in people who are in the military and writing, or people who've written for a long time, but also new writers. My first piece coming out of the military was for the War Horse, and I gave Kelly full permission to throw me under the bus and tell everyone how that process went. But I just wanted to ask Kelly, tell us a little bit about the pitching process. Why would we want to write for the War Horse? Why is it such a good opportunity?
Yeah, so if you're just coming out of the military, and whether you want to be a journalist or not, it's a great place to put your words out into the world, especially if you feel like there is a divide. Especially if you feel like there's something important you need to see to say that maybe people aren't hearing, or if you need to process through something, if you have a story you need to tell and kind of get it off your chest, let your family see it or your friends or whomever. So those reflections, we get a lot of them, so sometimes it takes a while before it runs, as you experienced, and you'd think that we got a bunch of them and a lot of people were turned down, but what I found is that we get a lot of really good writers, which reminds me of my time in the military when everyone thinks we're a bunch of grunts or legs or whatever, but the sense of humor in the military is funny and people are smart, and that's what comes across in the writing, and it's great. So reflections are 1,500 words. They are not editorials. They're not opinion pieces. It's not spouting off about what you think of Trump or Biden or anybody else, the food at the local restaurant. They're not book reviews. They're not movie reviews. They are personal experiences. They tend to be, kind of a slice of life. Sometimes they have bigger points, like I'm trying to think of a recent piece. We've got one running tomorrow that's just wonderful about a person's experience being blown up, or I'm sorry, being in a vehicle accident and thinking that something bad would happen to him when he was in combat, and instead having it happen when he's not in combat. And his point is that he still served and still can serve, even if it wasn't a war injury. So they're 1,500 words long. I keep saying that. They pay $300. And once it's in, you can hit me with an email and say, I want to write about a thing. And then we can talk about that. We can talk on the phone. I'm happy to kind of guide through the process. Or you can send me the whole piece and we'll work through that. And sometimes the pieces don't need very much. They're turned in and they look great. Sometimes there needs to be a little bit of coaching, like maybe you could fill in some more details about this because people don't know what that means, or you've written about something very broadly as opposed to bringing it in, like homing it in on a point. But that's my favorite part of the job, is working with service members and veterans to do that. And those stories have been about everything from experiences as a woman who feels like everybody assumes that she's a guy because she's in the military, to full-on grunt stuff. This is what it felt like to be in battle.
And so, with that diversity of population that you're getting, you obviously see a lot of different pitches. I'm sure some people have just sent you, a line or two that saying like, hey, I want to write about this, and you've built that into a full-fledged piece. And like you said, some people already have a full-fledged piece and it just requires some fine tuning. For you, if people are pitching to you just cold to the War Horse, what's kind of a preferred format for you? What would you like to see in a pitch that's kind of maybe the middle between those two?
Well, first of all, I'd like to be able to tell that you read the War Horse. So if you send me a pitch and the style of the essay is very obviously not, something that we would run, like I was saying, an opinion piece, or, like a commander's vision of what the way forward is, it isn't really what we do with our essays. Word documents are great. I get a lot of Google Docs. Those are fine too. PDFs, not so great. It's really hard to edit a PDF. We like to see 3 or 4 photos with those pieces and cut lines, or at least cut line information. So who, what, when, where, and then I can work it into a cut line. But as far as what you want to turn in, I think it really depends on the person I think some people have been sitting on a story for a while. They wrote it a while back and they don't know what to do with it. And maybe they've been kind of fiddling with it and they've finally gotten around to putting it out into the world. And other people are just kind of thinking about it still. How do I do this? And maybe need a little bit of help getting it started. So.
And so when someone sends you that pitch, what, as someone who gives the pitch, what's kind of like the first step to be expected? What should we got over the threshold, we sent the pitch in, we have an idea that we've formed. What's kind of the next step? What are you looking for?
Yeah, so I'll just be straight up there. We're a team of three. There's 3 people working full time at the Warhorse. So right now my email box is filled with 200 people who actually need to be answered. They're not just press releases or whatever. So it can take me a minute to get back to everybody. And because we have a backlog of pieces, I don't necessarily need to get back to everybody immediately. So, you figure out where your time needs to go. So be patient. That's the first thing. The second thing is I will go through the piece. I will send it back if it needs, a rewrite. I'll say, we can talk on the phone if this doesn't make sense to you. I'll often put it into a Google Doc at that point, and I might edit within the Google Doc so that the people can see what's been changed or what needs to be changed, like what needs to be sort of fleshed out. I'll ask for photos. I'll ask for cut lines if we haven't gotten those. After the piece has been edited, I'll edit it. If it looks pretty good, I'll just send it off to the copy editor and the fact checker, and they'll give it a read. We don't do military style, so we don't capitalize soldier, those kinds of public affairs things that you probably had to unlearn when you got out. Commanding officer, all those things are all lowercase unless they're in front of a name. So if you see those kinds of changes in your piece, that's the AP style that we use. Fact checker may have some questions. He's kind of he wants to make sure everything's right. He wants to make sure we don't get sued for libel or any of that stuff, which is important to us. So then I'll send it on to the headline writer, and Abby will add the SEO and the headlines. Our policy is to make sure that the writers see those headlines in the SEO before they go out. Just full disclosure, we had one story that went out where the writer didn't like the headlines, didn't feel like she was seen, and that the headlines made her look like a victim as opposed to someone who was saying, I'm calling you out on this. And ever since, we've made sure that writers and reporters too see those headlines. We'll try to learn as we go along. And then I send it off to our production manager, who puts it on the website. I'll give it a final read, and then it goes up. So that's it.
And before we kind of get into the editing process, could you explain the types of pitches that you receive? Because we talked about reflections, we talked about investigations, we talk about normal hard-hitting news, and then you also have an option on your website just to submit a tip. Maybe someone doesn't want to report a story, but they have a story that they know someone at the Warhorse needs to tell. Can you talk a little bit about those categories and the pitching process for each of them?
Yeah, so the one I just described was the reflections. That's sort of where most people start. People who have written before, or maybe have graduated from journalism school or whatever, have some experience as a writer. Can hit me with usually a story idea is best if you want to write a feature for us or you want to write an investigative piece. Again, make sure you read the Warhorse before you hit me with the pitch. I get pitches like, I'd like to write a story about how horseback riding helps PTS. Well, that's not really what we do. Those are great stories. Those aren't Warhorse stories. If you wanted to write a story about the PTS industry and how much money people are making off the different programs, yeah, hit me. I'm interested in that. So generally speaking, hit me with just that idea. This is what I want to write about. And then I'll probably ask for a proper pitch. And what that is what the top of your story would look like. So if you're reading the War Horse, you'll see that we've got a bit of a, I want to say like a format or a formula, but we do tend to do like a long narrative lead. You know, it's someone who's riding the horses and feels great after the PTS program. And I don't mean to say that horseback riding isn't effective. I'm just using this as an example, but the 6 months later, you know, she started drinking again or whatever. So that's the narrative lead. And it can be what I just said. It doesn't need to be already reported out, but here's an example of what the narrative lead might look like. And then there's the so what paragraph, the nut graph. And most people who've gone to school or public affairs probably know exactly what a nut graph is. But because there are differing ideas about what a nut graph is, we also have something we call the war horse graph. So in a pitch, you've got that nut graph that says, this is important because, you know, millions of people are making, or thousands of people are making millions of dollars off of PTS, and people are coming out of them without having been helped. And then the war horse graph is 3 or 4 sentences. I'm going to write about this, and I'm going to write about this, and I'm going to write about this, you know, or these are the 3 issues that came up while I was reporting this story. And then the last thing I like to see in a pitch is the sources you're going to talk to. So that's just for a feature. And those pay $1,000. The reflections pay $300. Those are kind of important things to know too. And then an investigative piece, we don't tend to have freelancers do those as often just because we don't have the funding really to pay for someone to do that much work. But we do sometimes pay people to help with projects. So, but if you've got a great idea for something that's going badly, certainly hit me and we can work on making that thing happen. As far as pitching an idea that you don't want to write, yeah, you can send me an email and just say, listen, I'm seeing this thing going on. And it's a problem. If you can give me something to go on, we're much more likely to do a story. If it's like, hey, I called this number and no one's answering, well, okay. Tell me more about the problem. If you're hearing a lot of other people are dealing with the same problem, just give me something to go on. If it's a particular therapist is not treating people or has lost their license or something, I need to know that person's name. And then once again, make sure you're reading the war horse. I get pitches up pretty often that have nothing to do with military or veteran issues at all. And that's a lot of email. So
No, that makes sense. So, you know, with those categories, right, you have the pitches in, and we're starting to develop the story as we kind of got into before. Before we get into the nitty gritty of editing, I wanted to see if you could point to a couple examples of, you know, pitches you've gotten from writers that are just starting out. Like they probably don't have a ton of clips from before, that maybe they don't have any, but you help them turn it into a great story that eventually got published. Or there are any examples that come to mind that you could tell some of the people that are viewing now?
yeah, I wouldn't say she's a beginning reporter. Sonnerkurt's been doing our climate reporting, and she's, you know, teaching at Berkeley, and she's got a few clips as a freelancer, but hasn't necessarily ever worked in a newsroom per se, you know. But her stuff came in and it was pretty solid. You know, I didn't have to do a lot. We talk things out first. She, you know, you guys are veterans. If we talk something out and say, do this, and this, you guys kind of know how to roll from there, you know. And are creative, of course, about ways to do things, because as people have been in the military or military spouses, you've had to be. So trying to think of someone else who maybe had less experience. And I talked about the warhorse graph. And part of the reason I do that is because a lot of our stories are a lot longer than what people are used to writing. And organizing them is hard. Like that's sort of advanced level reporting. And if you do that warhorse paragraph where you just say, I'm going to write about this, this, and this, well, then you basically have the sections marked out. And then you don't end up doing a notebook dump. Do you guys call it that too, a notebook dump?
Yeah.
So you basically just take everything that's in your notebook and write it down in the story that's been made into paragraphs, but it's not any kind of order. So that sort of outline allows you to get rid of the stuff that's not important. And for me, writing that warhorse graph, I'll sit down without my notes and just think about the things that stick out to me about this story. Like if I were gonna, this is the other old journalism trick. If I were gonna tell my mother, hey mom, you'll never guess what, you hit them with the Molly was riding her horse and this thing happened and then she came back and it all fell apart. And then I found out that no one or that all these people are spending all this money on these things and it's not effective. And then I found out that this has been going on for years and the federal government has been paying for programs that don't work, and that PTS sources say that only one kind of thing works and then this other thing. And those are your 3 sentences. And that's how you lay out your story. Obviously other things can come into play, but that's kind of the gist of it. And I find that with beginning reporters as well as more advanced reporters, I mean, I do this for the stories I write too. That's a good way to just get it down on paper and have it not get thoroughly rewritten by your editor. So
well, and someone asked a really good question. Don asked a question about how many words should a feature story be, and I'll expand that to that includes reflections. What are you looking for in like a regular news story? What does the word count look like for some of these stories? What should people be shooting for?
Yeah, so when I was at USA Today, I guess I forgot to say that paper earlier. When I was at USA Today, there wasn't a word count so much as write until it's done, but write it quickly. So I would say most newspapers are like that. A Webby probably has a typical length at a newspaper or a news publication. Newspaper, we didn't usually go more than 30 inches, and I can't even remember what the word count is for that. For the warhorse, our reflection pieces go 1,000 words to 1,500 words, and that's pretty much the cutoff. Our feature articles are at least 1,500 words, but again, you write until it's done. You try to cut out the extra. I just turned in a 16-page interview with the VA secretary. My old editors would probably argue that was about 14 pages too long, but we're a place where you can kind of really get into the nitty-gritty if you're working on something like that and it's important. So right until it's done.
And well, I think that's an important distinction too, because that it is different from a lot of other news organizations that do have a cap on features too. And I think that speaks more a lot about the warhorse audience too. Can you tell us a little bit about your readership before we talk about editing, and what, like, obviously you've had success so far in longer stories. How is that success manifested with these long stories? How does that, why does your readership want to read these long stories when other news organizations aren't maybe not be doing that?
Mm-hmm. I think because we're able to go deep and we're able to explain the history of something. We've had policymakers, we've had the White House call and say, keep doing this because it makes it easier for us to hand it to someone and say, this is why, it's rather than just like the daily hit of this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong. We're trying really hard to do solutions-based journalism. So you kind of lay out the problem, but then you also say, how can this be fixed? or how is it being fixed, or what is background stuff you're not seeing. So like for the VA secretary, he's walking into a crap job. It's 30 years of history of people getting fired, and backlogs, and disgruntled people, and people doing a great job, and just political overhead and budget fights. And so even if you go in there and you're thinking that you're going to make your best effort, you could come out broken. So I think that's one of the big differences. We get a long read rate, so people stay on our stories. I think it's an average of 9 minutes. And people read those reflections all the way through. So, I mean, I've actually been really amazed at how strong the readership is on our reflections. People really, really love getting to understand that a little bit better. So, I mean, I was talking about a formula before, but it seems to work. Like, people know what they're going to read, and so they stick around to find out all the things they want to find out. I don't know if I've answered your question on that one.
No, that you did, and that makes sense. And really, it's just kind of like you have the ability to go in depth. You have to produce the quality instead of the quantity, and then be able to have that extended, which, coming as a new journalist and new writer, that's important to have a place that, because I feel like new journalists tend to overwrite sometimes, put too much in, and it's a lot easier to cut away. But it's also a lot easier, or it's, if you have the material there, you can mold it. Which is why I want to kind of transition into the editing part, because I think, especially for a lot of new writers, the editing process can be kind of daunting. And having someone like you who works with new writers and veteran writers and all types of writers, to help shepherd that through is really important to have. So can you, explain? I know you talked a little bit about editing, but explain the editing process and what you would tell a new writer who's just entering it for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, I try to think about how I felt as a new writer. And I look back at those first essays that I wrote when I came out of the Army, and there were so many things I was trying to figure out. I'd gotten out of Somalia, and why the hell were we there, and what was going on, and Desert Storm too. Like, I didn't understand any of the political background. You're basically a kid, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but we just didn't have a lot of experience, most of us, when we joined. And then you get out and you're in the same spot again. Like, it feels like everyone's a few years ahead of you, if not 20 years ahead of you on things like writing. And so for me, writing has always been a learning process. Like, I've never gotten rid of that. And when someone comes in to write for us, I like to think about that in the times I wasn't able to get that from an editor because of the daily grind, or so when I'm working with a writer, I like to be able to say, I'm changing this thing, but here's why. If it's a bunch of small edits, I don't usually worry about it too much. But if it's AP style, I might say I changed this because of AP style. If a person is writing in passive voice, and you and I may have talked about this, I talk about this to just about everybody. Passive voice doesn't allow the person doing the action to take ownership. So mistakes were made instead of I made mistakes. So active voice gives your piece authority. Active voice makes your writing breezier. And I don't mean like butterflies and bubbles. I mean quicker for busy people. It's easier to read writing that's an active voice. So I might talk about that with a new writer. And it's never a dig. It's always like here's how you can get better, instead of just like rewriting your stuff. And I don't think that's the best way for someone to learn. And there's times when we're all busy and I can't do that, but I try to. But as far as editing, it's such an individual thing. we talked a little before about pre-editing. So if someone has a story idea, they're not really sure what to do with it, they're not really sure how to write it, we can talk on the phone. And most of the time, after you've kind of talked about it a little bit, then you've got a good idea of where you want to start and the things you want to say. And you just need a sounding board. And that's a big part of editing, I think. So,
And you've had pieces that were written by people who are still in the military, people just fresh out of the military. Can you talk a little bit about that process? Because like for example, the big one that comes to mind is the DC National Guardsmen who wrote a really great piece about their time around the Capitol, and they did it anonymously. And I think that's like that's an important thing to point out, kind of like the variety of stories that you get. But how do you navigate those kind of those issues, or people who have this great story to tell but might not have the bandwidth to tell it?
yeah. So, as you know, we verify everybody's service to make sure that they are who they say they are, because we don't, like, the last thing you want is an anonymous National Guard member who's not really, you know. So we know who he is, and we've verified his stuff, and we've seen his pictures, and he's actually written 2 stories now. And we felt that issue was important enough that it was worth putting him in there anonymously. If you want to write a story about how much your boss sucks and you're still in the military, we're probably not going to run that anonymously. It's just not an important issue. For you, I remember we had to talk a little bit about, is your audience your boss, or is your audience the war horse? In the military, you're always thinking about the boss, right? Like, am I going to get in trouble for this? So I believe we worked, like, you showed it to your supervisor, right?
Yeah, I showed it to the brigade commander, and
Go big or go home.
yeah. But it was it was good because we had already written the piece, we had already done 99% of the work. It just coming from my experience, if you're in the military and you want to write something like that, people are more likely to say yes if you've already done all the work, and say, by the point that we had done it, we had already gotten approved with legal and S2 and all that stuff. And so there wasn't any editorial influence that I can think of that the Army had over the piece that we published.
Right.
That was because of the work that you had done with me as a new writer, to help me navigate that. And why I'm glad you brought it up, because it was, it can be daunting having a story that you need to tell, but also being beholden to the organization that you're telling it about. But there was, going through that process with you, there was no question that the piece was for the war horse audience when all was said and done.
Right. Well, and it was an important piece too. You were writing about an important issue, and you could have faced some pretty odd backlash maybe for that one. I don't know what you did end up facing, actually, if it was mostly positive feedback, or if you want to talk a little bit about what your piece was
Sure. Actually, like a couple days after it, so the piece was about extremism, and obviously that's kind of a touchy subject, but I was part of some of the groups that did the extremism stand down, and kind of talked a lot about that in front of groups of soldiers, and had this insight into what albeit a small, it's about 120 people that I talked to throughout the course of like a couple of days, but an insight into like what some soldiers thought. I wrote it, Kelly and I worked it, and then that's actually when the hard work started, was because I didn't want to do this anonymously, but you still have to be careful with Article 88, and making sure you aren't being derogatory while being in uniform, that type of thing. And then getting it approved through legal. It published, and then I think a couple days later, someone from the Corps PAO leadership, who I assume had talked to everyone in my brigade chain of command before they had talked to me, said that it had made its rounds in the Pentagon, at the in the public affairs offices, and I think not having you to help me kind of shepherd, to shepherd me through that process and then go and be able to tell that story. I don't think I would have been able to tell it. I don't think I would have been able to cut through, kind of the bureaucracy and kind of game it so we could be able to tell it, but tell it truthfully without being a megaphone for the army or the military. And then the outcome was, something for the Warhorse audience, but also gaining the attention of it really telling these soldiers' stories and what they thought about something that maybe someone else, higher up in the Pentagon Public Affairs Office, in the Corps Public Affairs Office, may have never heard before.
Right.
Why it's important with the work that you're doing is incredibly important. So,
Well, we talked about how we get notes from policymakers and the White House or whatever because of these stories, but it's the reflections too. People don't know that this is what you're seeing on a daily basis, or as these courses go through, as we address extremism. It's an important viewpoint.
I will say that when I did receive that email from the lieutenant colonel in the Corps shop, I saw the subject and I was like, oh man, this is not going to be good, but it was fine and everyone worked out, and it was all good.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you mentioned that about new writers, and there are options that, and you will work with people who are still in the military or fresh out. Mm-hmm. But I also wanted to ask you about people who are veteran writers. Like, obviously you work with people who write a lot, and I'm sure that comes with its own challenges as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what that process is like?
Generally speaking, people are pretty open to edits, which sort of surprised me. Wasn't sure what the personalities would be like coming into this job. But even the people who I kind of expect to push back might, and I'm always open to pushback. Like, I don't mean to say that I've got the right way. But even the people I expect to be like, no, I want it written this way, are pretty open to suggestions and switching things around. I think our track record is pretty good. I think people know that they get read. So that's a good thing to kind of fall back on. Challenges. I get people who want to write about sort of personal things about other people. And we have to be careful about that. If someone's identifiable, then you could have a libel suit. So we had someone write about a former boss recently, and we were careful to make sure that person wasn't identifiable, because on that one we actually figured if the person came forward and said, hey, this is about me, they would sort of be admitting the truthfulness of the story, which was a defense against libel. So we were probably okay. Didn't happen, so it was okay.
Well, I think it's great that you mentioned that, because even though you're just 3 people, you do provide writers with this really big safety net. In my mind, when I was writing for you, especially as a new writer, there was you who could edit it, make sure that it was aesthetic and readable, but also you have fact checkers and someone who copy edits and someone who's aware of the legal implications. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we do have legal, and anytime something looks like it needs an extra read, like every time Thomas writes about public affairs people, we send it through legal, so being a little facetious there, but there have definitely been pieces where we just want to make sure we've got all those T's crossed, because we are a small organization and a lawsuit's a big deal. So they'll just do a review, but then our fact checker and and me, we both have a background in media law and just from school and over the years paying attention. Military law too. And then the copy editor as well. I mean, it's always embarrassing when you make an error, a misspelled name or something like that. But a legal error and that, I mean, we're seeing it with the New York Times right now in the Sarah Palin cat case. So you don't even want to have to deal with that. So
Right.
it's risks you'll take when you know that your story is straight, but you don't want to accidentally cause a lawsuit. So
For the editing process and the publishing process, can you tell us a little bit about what happens when a piece goes out? Where do you put it on your social media? Do you send it out via email? All the above? What's kind of like the rollout of a piece?
yeah, so it goes out in our weekly newsletter. So it'll be the top spot in the Warhorse newsletter, which is free. You guys should all go sign up for it if you haven't. And then underneath that'll be the week's news. So it's kind of a small version of the early bird or something like that. I tweet them out, put them up on LinkedIn. The rest of the team does as well. Very often, I think yours was picked up by Military Times and military.com. Task and Purpose too, right? All three of them.
I think it was just military.com.
Okay. Well, depending on the piece, they'll get picked up by other newspapers. We've had pieces picked up by their local newspapers, which is cool to see. Yeah, and then they go on kind of a, if we're publishing another newsletter, there'll be a list of previous reflections. So those will go out too, even if they were written 2 years ago, because some of these are evergreens.
And I wanted to ask about that because, I already knew that the answer is that, the Warhorse is very accessible. As you mentioned up top, like you can, it's like the ProPublica for military, journalism, where other pieces can just take it and run it, which is really important. I don't think that people, for example, I don't think people saw my piece because it was, anything was particularly special about it, but you guys have a really great system of, rolling it out and allowing others to see it. I think the local news is that local organizations pick it up is great because it's cool to think that, you're writing this piece about something that maybe someone in Idaho or Arizona may have never, thought to even read about, but their local piece picks it up because someone saw it, they had the ability to republish it.
Right.
So, one of the things that you put a premium on, and I know Thomas does as well, is paying your freelancers. We talked a little bit about it, and I know just from talking to you, both of you, that you have been stiffed before for on writing freelance pieces. And that's something that you don't want to do to your freelancers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's not just stiffed. It's, I mean, I worked as a freelancer for years, and there's places that'll pay you $200 for a 30-inch story, and man, no one can make a living on that. So, and while we understand that, $1,000 for a piece isn't necessarily enough to make a living, if you're adding it to a pile of other work or you're trying to get clips, it's pretty good rate. I mean, especially for a newspaper. And then our investigative reporting positions that are opening up are as much as I made at USA Today, they pay. So, we're trying to make sure it's a living wage. Because we're a remote team, you could live in North Carolina and make a decent pay working for the Warhorse. And that's so important to everyone on the team. Last year, we all worked for pretty low rates, and Thomas is trying to build the budget, and all of a sudden, boom, there it is, and we're hiring and looking toward the future. But it's all really thought about. Like Thomas doesn't want to hire people until he knows that he can pay them properly. So yeah, it's important. It's, you know, we all worked in newsrooms where we faced furloughs and didn't get raises for years, or, you know, watched our friends get laid off, got laid off ourselves. It's just don't want that to be part of our culture. So
Well, and that also speaks to one of the questions we brought up at the beginning is, why work for the Warhorse? We talked about the audience, we talked about, the quality, the editing process, but you're a growing organization from where I sit. And with that, like you have these positions, you have these, the ability to pay your freelancers. Like you said, you have people who really want to write for you. You got your inbox full of reflections. I guess what's next, for the Warhorse, where you want to grow?
yeah, so we're hiring these 2 investigative reporters. We're looking at hiring a production manager, which should take some of the load off of me a bit so I can spend more time with the reporters. We'll still be taking freelancers, of course. But the big growth, we want to eventually hire more reporters, but also we're thinking about a spouses network. We've got, as we're working on these projects, we've got a built-in system, about built-in network of people who have journalism degrees, but maybe have a hard time using those journalism degrees because they're stationed, their husband, their wife is stationed in Korea, and it's hard to take a job in a newsroom and keep that job if you're going to be somewhere else in a couple of years, or spouse freelancers who can contribute to a big piece we're working on. If we decide we're going to write about toxic underpants being passed out by the Marine Corps, what's happening at Lejeune, what's happening at Pendleton, this is what I saw in my laundry, whatever. So,
And that, not to outright plug MVJ, but you also have this network of military veterans in journalism through our organization that what I've seen is kind of both nonprofits growing together and being able to do that, which is part of the reason why we're here today as well.
yeah.
But that's super great to hear, and I want to, for the last 10 minutes, open it up for questions. But before we do, we talked about the Warhorse. We talked about these opportunities that are coming up. Is there anything that you want the attendees to know, or maybe ask you questions about before we open it up?
I would say that our big push this year is taking national issues and looking at them through a military lens. So if you're going to come at me with story ideas and you can come at me with that lens, I'm going to probably be interested. So, what are the things that you think are the most important things that our nation is facing right now? And how does the military or the veterans community relate to that? And they always do. There's always a way in that way. So
perfect. So for the attendees, you can go ahead and raise your hand through the Zoom, and I'll click on you and you can speak, or you can do what Jamie just did, and just put a question in the chat, and I can ask it for you. So to answer Jamie's question, is there a need for freelance photographers?
there's a need, but there's not necessarily the money yet. So occasionally there is. We've got a piece coming out soon that we're going to probably hire a freelance photographer. We'll probably be doing more of that in the future. So yeah, hit me with your resume and your clips, and we'll make sure we know you're out there. We answered everything.
I know. I'm gonna leave it open because I a couple questions, not to kind of steal the air. I'll leave the chat open, and if anyone wants to raise their hand. We talked a little bit about. I'll just go from my own perspective about being Oh, here. Okay, good. I don't have to ask my question. Kelsey has a good one. How do we learn about when freelance assistance may be needed on larger projects? That's a great question.
Yeah, so I'm trying to put together a stable of freelancers. So if you're interested in freelancing for me and you are interested in being assigned something, hit me. Like if you're a military spouse on a base somewhere and you're available to dig in when we need you, send me your resume, send me your clips. If you don't have clips, if you're just starting, let me know and we can work with you on that too. I mean, I'm probably not going to assign someone who hasn't written before a big feature, but I'm happy to start the coaching process and figure out how to get you there. So,
And with those projects, does that include, if you have a large piece that include researchers, do you have a need for like extra copy editors sometimes, or is it just you're looking for straight up reporters?
right now, straight up reporters, but things are moving pretty quickly, so it can change.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me type in my email address too, if anyone wants to hit me.
Oh, I think that might have been just sent to us.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
While we're waiting for a couple more questions, the process for writing a reflection for on my end was really smooth. I don't think I would have felt comfortable or been able to do that in other newsrooms or with other editors, because you've been editing for a while. You get a lot of freelancers, you get a lot of reflections, but for me, I was still in uniform, not really sure talking about a specific somewhat touchy subject. It was just made, that those types of situations are made for the warhorse specifically. I can't really, there are other organizations that can do that, but not ones that would write at the length that you guys write at, and not ones that would kind of take the care and length of time that it would need to do pieces like that.
It was an important piece too. I mean, kind of think that about all of them, but that was really newsworthy at the time. And yeah.
Crispin has a good question. Do you have a need to have someone assist with the daily newsletter, or perhaps do quick pieces on breaking news like troop deployments to Europe, those types of things?
Not yet. I mean, right now we're really focusing on those features and the investigative stuff and the reflections. And I mean, it would be great to do those things, but right now we just don't have the bandwidth to do everything. And those other publications, military.com, Military Times, we don't consider ourselves competition, and they do a great job with that stuff. And Leo Shane, Patricia Keim, wonderful reporters. They've got a lot of great reporters. So, we feel like our job there is to kind of help those newsrooms with investigations and in longer form pieces, not get the stuff that they're already good at. So
Carlos asked a question. Do you need freelancers in the Washington, D.C. area?
I need freelancers everywhere. Like, it's again, it's more features and investigative pieces, but we're everywhere. We're a remote newsroom. It doesn't matter to me where you are. So.
And Addison asked, do you have freelancers that are reporting from Ukraine?
We don't, no.
I'm sure probably be interested in stories coming out of there for sure.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they would still need to be big picture stories, rather than breaking news. Although if there were some amazing thing that they were seeing, we'd probably take that.
Well, Clay, is there anything else that you want the attendees to know? And I also, shameless plug for you. I know you just got off book leave for a new book. Is that something that you'd be willing to talk to us about as well?
Yeah, there's right when right before 9/11, there was a woman who was spying for Cuba for like 17 years for DIA. She worked at DIA. She was like the head analyst on Cuba for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and they didn't know she was a woman. So the FBI was kind of looking for the spy that they knew was there, but they were looking for, you know, a dude, because most spies are dudes. So the book is about her and about him, the FBI agent, Pete Lapp, catching her, and how that process worked, but also the importance of it, because she had all this information right as 9/11 happened, and they were going to move her to a position where she would have had all the plans for Afghanistan. And, you know, Castro at the time was like buddy buddy with Russia. So yeah, it's been really fun.
That sounds fun. When is it coming out, if you don't, if you know?
We're not sure. It has to go through FBI review, and
Got it.
things can take a while. So
Yeah. You have to do your own reviews. That's good. Well, Kelly, yeah, I speak for a lot of people chiming in the chat. This was incredibly informative. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. And I do hope that you know, this yields you some great freelancers and some great reflections, maybe some hard-hitting news pieces or investigations. But this was incredible. So thank you so much for doing it.
thank you. When are you going to write for me again?
Hey, whenever you need me, I'll be here.
Great.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.